Welcome back everyone to another Marvel Champions video. I am Dylan from All You Can Board, and this is of course Galaxy's Most Wanted, which is the second boxed expansion for Marvel Champions. Now today we are going to do a full review of Galaxy's Most Wanted. I am not going to go through every single card in the box. It's not going to be like when I do the hero reviews and I go through every single card because there's just way too many. This would be a 3-hour video if I went and talked about every card in detail. Obviously, they're not all player cards. There's all kinds of cards in here. What I am going to do is we're going to start by talking about everything that's new in here that does not have to do with a card. It's going to be sort of the mechanics, the new keywords, different things that you're going to see that you haven't seen in other hero packs and other expansions in Marvel Champions. We're also going to go through all the villains. I'm not going to go through every card, but I'm going to go highlight some of my, the standout cards for each villain, the ones I think that are the most difficult to deal with, the ones that define that villain. I'm going to tell you which ones I think are the most difficult, which ones I found to be a little bit easier. Spoiler alert, this is a pretty hard campaign. I wouldn't call any of them particularly easy, at least with Rock and Groot, which is what I went through the campaign with. One thing we're not going to talk about, now that I mention it, is not Rocket and Groot specifically, because I have covered 2 videos, each one on each of the heroes, going through every single card. If you want to find out more about Rocket Raccoon and about Groot and what they bring, watch those videos. I will link them at the end of this video, and I might link one of them above right now as well that you can click on. So those are something we will not touch on, but yeah, we will go through all the villains. I will touch on some of the modular sets. I'm also going to touch on the market cards, which is one of the new mechanics we will talk about. So without further ado, and at the end I will give my full review on what I think of this campaign, how I think it compares to Rise of the Red Skull, and how it slots in just overall for the value you get in Marvel Champions as a whole. So without further ado, we're going to jump right into it. Let's start with everything that is new in terms of mechanics, keywords that you can find in Galaxy's Most Wanted. Okay, let's start things off with keywords. There's a few brand new keywords that you haven't seen before that are in Galaxy's Most Wanted. We're going to start with Hinder. Now, Hinder will always have a value after it, so they kind of listed in the rulebook as Hinder X. Basically, when a card with Hinder is revealed, whatever the number is after it, you're going to start with that much threat on that card. Now, sometimes it'll be like Hinder 2 and then the little player icon, so it's 2 per player. Whatever the case may be, it's just saying that there's going to be extra threat that this card starts with when it is revealed. So it's fairly simple. That is Hinder. Next up is Patrol. I actually really like this new edition, and it makes sense. I'm surprised it actually wasn't in the game yet. We have had Guard before, and Guard is of course almost like a taunt mechanic like you've seen in other card games, where you cannot attack the main villain until you defeat the Guard minion. Patrol is basically the same thing, but for the main scheme. So while a minion with Patrol is out, you cannot thwart and remove threat from the main scheme until you deal with this minion. Now, it's a great addition, and it actually creates for some really tricky scenarios that we'll see in some of the villains where you really want as your main goal to remove threat from the main scheme, and these pesky Patrol minions come out and stop you from doing that. Great addition. I'm glad it's here. That is Patrol. All right, the next one is Stalwart. Now, Stalwart is fairly simple. There is just one thing about it that I do want to mention. So Stalwart is that any enemy that has Stalwart cannot be stunned or confused. Now, as you can imagine, this lends to some very tough situations where you may have had a deck or a situation that relied on being able to stun lock a villain or an enemy, or just keep them stunned or confused very often to help yourself out. Stalwart does not allow you to do that. One thing to mention with this is that if you already have a stun or confuse token on an enemy or villain and they gain Stalwart after the fact, those tokens do come off. It doesn't matter that they happened before. Stalwart also removes any current stun and confuse tokens that are on enemies. So one thing to note, otherwise fairly simple, but it is a very difficult keyword to deal with in my experience so far. Next up is Villainous. Villainous is really cool. Basically what happens is you'll see Villainous show up on minions. If a minion has the Villainous keyword, it basically means that they now get boost cards when they scheme or attack. So normally minions do not get boost cards. It's the strict value of what is on their card. Boost cards are a mainstay for villains and villains alone. Villainous is basically making a minion act as though it's a villain. So you will draw a boost card, you will apply the boost icons to the attack or the scheme. If there is a bonus boost effect on the bottom of that card, you will apply that. It gets discarded the same way. You basically treat that minion as if it's a villain when it schemes or attacks. Can be very difficult to deal with, as you can imagine, and it pops up a few times in the campaign. Okay, and the last new keyword is one that if you have played the Arkham Horror card game will be very familiar to you because it basically functions the exact same way. This is of course victory. So victory will have a number after it, so it could say victory 1 or victory 2. Basically, a card with a victory, when you defeat it, you are going to add it to a victory display. Now, the victory display is basically an out-of-game area that you cannot interact with that is only going to come into play when the game is finished. So you can add cards to this victory display, and specifically in this campaign, it could be different in other campaigns in the future, but in this campaign, at the end, you're going to gain credits for every victory number that's in this display, and you can spend those credits to buy new cards from the market to insert into your deck for this campaign specifically. Again, if you've played Arkham Horror, the card game, this is a mainstay. Every scenario has a victory display, as far as I know, at least all the ones I've played, and you're adding to that victory display, and that's giving you experience that allows you to buy cards. So basically what Galaxy Most Wanted has done here is it's unique to the Marvel game so far, but it's not a unique mechanic when it comes to Fantasy Flight living card games. They basically just introduced the entire concept that is present in Arkham Horror, the card game, with the victory display, being able to buy cards from the market and have them applied to your scenario. It's limited very much to the scenario. You're not going to add these cards into your deck if you're just doing one-offs against villains. I mean, you can, there's nothing stopping you, but they're very, very powerful cards. But that is the victory display. So fairly simple, and again, it'll only really come up when you're running the campaign for Galaxy's Most Wanted. There is one new icon that you're going to see pop up a whole bunch in this campaign, and that is the Amplify icon. So just like we had the icon that makes you draw one additional encounter card, or it puts an acceleration token on the main scheme, there's now the Amplify icon. What this does is that every time you draw a boost card for an enemy, you're adding one additional boost icon to it. Even if it's a 0, it now becomes a 1. So that applies for all the minions in play, all the villains in play, anyone who is drawing a boost card. You are going to have to amplify that by 1. Again, it's not the worst thing to deal with, but it really depends on the situation. I've had situations where that one icon with a couple minions out that have villainous and the enemy have just completely overwhelmed me in a turn, and I've had other games where I've actually just left it because it was more advantageous to me to sort of do other things, and I just dealt with the extra 1 damage or extra 1 scheme that was coming my way from the villain. So it's hit or miss in terms of how difficult it is, but regardless, it's a really cool addition to the game, and it just creates for an extra layer that you have to consider and deal with when you're fighting different villains. Okay, so the idea of a campaign for Marvel Champions is not new because we've obviously had a campaign already introduced with the Rise of the Red Skull. Something that is new, however, is the market cards that I alluded to. There were extra cards that you could add into your deck from Rise of the Red Skull, but the entire system is a little different here. So again, I've explained the victory display, I've explained victory cards. What you're going to be doing with those victory cards, or the cards that have the victory keyword, is you're going to be gaining credits. Every camp mission or scenario in the campaign is going to have a different ending that basically says add credits to each of your characters depending on these criteria. And there's a whole bunch of different criteria depending on who you're playing and how that scenario played out. There is a deck of cards basically that you can buy as part of the market in between scenarios. You can basically, I think the thematics of it it's like you're spending your credits to power up your characters between missions. So they start with 1 cost. There's a whole section of them that are just all 1 cost, and those are, I would say, the least powerful of the cards. I mean, obviously that's subjective. Some could be different in different situations, but there's a reason they only cost 1. And they go all the way up to 7 costs, and the 7 cost ones are by far the most powerful. They're completely overpowered. They'll be like 0 cost cards that do crazy things for you. So just I'll throw out a couple examples, throw them up on the screen so you can kind of get an idea of what you're adding to your deck. But for instance, By Any Means is a 1 cost a market card that you can buy. It's a 0 cost, and it says place 2 threat on the main scheme, deal 3 damage to the villain, and draw a card. So it's not completely overpowered. You're having to actually take threat onto the main scheme, but you're dealing 3 damage to the villain and you're drawing a card for 0 cost, which is obviously very good. So these obviously get better as we go. So if we get up to, I'm going to find a higher cost one here. So for instance, a 5 cost one is called Onrush. Unit cost is 5. When a card is revealed from the encounter deck, cancel the effects of that card and discard it for 0. That's incredible. There's tons of situations, especially when you get to the harder bosses or the final boss of this expansion, where for 0 cost, just canceling an entire encounter card is huge. And in fact, specifically for Ronin, you might want this in your deck just because of how many encounter cards you're having to take and how devastating they can be to your characters. I'll give a couple examples of the strongest ones in the game. So for instance, Triple Threat is a 7-cost card, 0 cost for 0 resources, ready up to 3 characters, remove this card from the game. So readying 3 characters for 0 is insane. Obviously, if you're playing a leadership deck with a bunch of allies who can do a whole bunch of stuff, this could be a game ender, a game changer, something that completely swings the game. So as you can see, there's a whole bunch of different market cards. I won't go through them all. Part of the fun is kind of like browsing the market in between each scenario. It's just a new cool addition to Galaxy's Most Wanted, where you're basically gaining money for how well you do in a scenario and then being able to spend it on powerful cards to put into your deck. So that is the new campaign system. Again, all of these campaign scenarios, the 5 villains, can all be played outside of the campaign, just, you know, as a standalone villain. So you're gaining 5 villains that you can now play standalone, and there's some really cool ones in here. So that's really neat. There's, just like the Red Skull, there's also an expert level version of the campaign that changes things up, makes it harder, has persistent damage. You know, you don't get victory credits if one of your characters died in the scenario and only one lived. The one who died doesn't get the victory credits. There's a whole bunch of things that the expert campaign adds on top of stronger villains, stronger schemes, a whole bunch of stuff. It's a really difficult campaign even at normal, so the expert level campaign is going to be insane. So if you're looking for a challenge, you're gonna get it here. Okay, I want to briefly talk about some of the new modular sets and modular cards that you can add into villain decks. Now, I'm not going to talk about all of them. They're obviously all new, and there's tons of really cool ones in there, cool new minions. They introduced the new keywords and things like that. But I want to talk about the ones that are specifically very unique and I found very different and interesting and enjoyed playing with in the campaign. So the first one I'm going to talk about is the Badoon Headhunter. So this is a set of 5 cards, a modular set, but you don't add all 5 in right from the start. So the Badoon Headhunter gets added in, and he's a strong minion, a relatively strong minion. He's got like 7 health, only 1 scheme, 1 attack, but he is villainous, so he gets boost cards. But he has a victory 2 on him. So it's in your best interest to defeat the Badoon Headhunter if he comes out in your game, because getting those 2 credits are going to allow you to buy better cards in the market. However, every single scenario in your campaign that you defeat the Badoon Headhunter, you're going to have to add another card from his modular set into the next campaign. So the more you beat him, yes, the more credits you gain, but the more difficult the villain deck becomes by adding the further Badoon Headhunter cards in, and they're pretty nasty. Like there's one I don't have it in front of me, but it's basically like Surge is the first keyword, and then on top of Surge into another encounter card, it also like exhausts your hero and potentially does something else. They're none of them are great, and they get progressively worse. They add stronger minions into the deck, things like that. I found this really interesting, and in my games, I constantly drew the Badoon Headhunter and I kept killing him. I think I killed him in every single scenario except for one, which meant that I got a bunch of credits to buy cards, but the villain deck was full of these Badoon Headhunter cards that were just awful to deal with, but it added an extra layer of challenge too. So if you don't want to make your deck the deck more challenging to play against, don't defeat the Badoon Headhunter, but then you also have to figure out a way to just deal with them while he's in play. It's a catch-22, but I found that to be really, really cool. My favorite modular set that's introduced is the most unique one, I think, and that is the Ship Command modular set. So it's used in a lot of scenarios. I don't know if it's every scenario. If not, it's most, if not all, of the scenarios. But what is interesting about the Ship Command modular set is that one of the cards doesn't actually go into the villain deck. It actually goes in front of one of your heroes, and that's the Milano, which is your ship, the Guardians of the Galaxy ship. So it's a permanent. It happens during setup, so it always ends up in front of one of your characters, and it has an ability, which is just to exhaust it to generate a wild resource. But it always has another function depending on the scenario you're playing against. So one scenario might say, exhaust the Milano to remove 3 threat from the main scheme, or exhaust the Milano to remove a token from this particular card that wants to have tokens. You're basically using the Milano differently in every scenario, and it usually is something that you're having to balance, saying, yes, it gives me this wild resource, which would be great, but I could really use the threat removed from the scheme, or I could really use a counter removed from here, whatever the case may be. You're constantly having to use it in different ways. I found that to be tons of fun. And then the rest of the cards in the Ship Command modular set that are put into the villains deck usually have ways to exhaust your Milano and to try to basically counteract the Milano's strength. So for instance, Blindside is when revealed, you have to choose one, either exhaust the Milano, spend 2 fist resources, or stun the first player. Obviously exhausting the Milano is probably the least the least bad of those three options, but at the same time, it depends on the scenario. Sometimes you're really relying on the Milano to be able to do things. So all the cards for Ship Command interact with the Milano, and the Milano ends up being very important in the scenarios. I found that to be just super interesting. I really enjoyed the Milano and the entire Ship Command deck and how that worked. That was by far my favorite modular set, and it's definitely, I would say, the most unique out of all the ones that are introduced in the box. All right, let's talk about the villains. I know this is probably one of the main things you're wanting to hear with this video. It's probably one of the biggest incentives besides the heroes, even maybe more than the heroes for some people, to buy these expansions, because you get 5 villains and 5 new scenarios to fight through. So I'm gonna go through them in the order that they're presented in the scenario, starting from Drang and ending with Ronin. And I'm gonna give you my thoughts on the difficulty level. And at the end of all 5, I'll rank them in terms of what I think are the easiest and which ones I think are the hardest, because it's not necessarily 1 to 5 as you would potentially expect. So we're going to start with Drang. Again, I'm not going to go through every single card. I'm just going to highlight some of the ones that I thought were really important. I'm going to talk a little bit about my experiences in fighting that villain. So Drang overall wasn't super difficult for me. That being said, it did take me 2 tries, mostly because the first time I played, I was playing with Rocket and Groot for the very first time. And I think I played a little too aggressively, thinking, oh, this is easy, I have this in the bag, and then completely was surprised in the second phase of Drang and was overwhelmed, and I barely lost. So it took me 2 tries, but that doesn't reflect necessarily how difficult it was. I didn't think it was too difficult, but the mechanics are pretty interesting. So Drang's actual level 1 hero card, or villain card, is for 1 scheme to attack, force response. After Drang schemes, resolve the Badoon ship's charge up ability. So it's important to talk about the Badoon ship, because that is everything to do with Drang, involves this environment card that's going to be in play right from when you start, and it's always going to remain in play. So this vehicle has an ability, it's charge up, special, place 1 barrage counter here. Then if there are 4 or more barrage counters here, deal 2 indirect damage to each player and remove all the counters. So basically, this card wants to continue to get counters as fast as it can to be able to do 2 indirect damage to both players and then refresh the counters and start that process again. At the start, I found that I almost completely forgot about the environment card because it just wasn't gaining counters very quickly, and I thought, oh, this is easy to manage, and it's even when it hits 4, it's only going to do 2 damage to me. I can outpace this thing. As I got to the second phase of the villain card, and more minions and cards came out that added counters, I got overwhelmed by it, and then I learned about that for the second time I played Drang, and then it wasn't too difficult. But basically, every time Drang schemes, he's going to add a counter to this. So going to alter ego form has this added negative of basically allowing this Badoon ship to power up. So you have to really think about that when you're choosing whether you're going to flip to alter ego form. There's an extra incentive to stay in hero form, which worked out when I was playing with Groot, because Groot already kind of wants to stay in hero form unless he needs to charge up his growth counters, but he has other ways with fruition and things like that to add growth counters. So it was an interesting dynamic, having this extra reason not to go to alter ego form. One other thing I'll mention with Drang is that he does have this other card that comes out called Drang's Spear, and specifically in his second form, in Drang's second form, it's when it is revealed, if Drang's Spear is in play, you give Drang 1 face down boost card. Otherwise, you're going to search your deck and discard pile for Drang's Spear, reveal it, put it onto Drang. And then he has the same force response with when he schemes, he adds a charge or a counter to Badoon ship. So Drang's Spear it gives Drang Stalwart. That's basically all it does, besides giving him +1 attack. So it's powering up his attack, making him so that he can't be stunned and confused. And you have to spend 3 resources, 2 fists and 1 mind to be able to discard it. So it's just an extra thing that he's trying to get a hold of is his spear, and you're potentially trying to either stop him from getting that or discarding it. But when he has it, he's obviously a lot more powerful. Besides that, the actual main schemes have ways to add counters to the Badoon ship as well. So after resolving step 1 of the villain phase, you're always resolving the charge up ability on Badoon's ship. So basically every villain phase, there's stuff going on with the Badoon ship, whether you like it or not. The cool thing with the main scheme is that the Milano can remove 3 threat from the main scheme just by exhausting it, which you'll have to use very often because the main scheme actually adds threat pretty quickly. It's +2 per player every villain phase. So I was playing with Rocket and Groot, so that was 4 threat every single time, and it only can take 16. So for this first card. So I use the Milano a lot to get rid of threat off that scheme just to help things out. But again, it's all a balance and depends which kind of heroes you're playing and how much you can mitigate the threat in the main scheme, perhaps without using the Milano. The only other thing I'll mention is that there are minions in the deck called Badoon Engineers that are, low health, not overly difficult to deal with. However, their forced responses, as soon as it engages you or activates against you, you have to resolve the Badoon ship ability. So they're pesky in the sense that if you don't get rid of them, that Badoon ship is just going to keep on firing. So overall, like I said, Drang I didn't find to be too difficult, but it really is going to depend how much you can deal with the threat on the main scheme, how much you're set up for that. In my case, Rocket was more than capable of dealing with the threat, and I had the Milano ship as the backup sort of, and then the rest of it is just going to be how much you're having to deal with the Badoon ship. Again, mitigate it as much as you can. Don't take it for granted and think it's not a big deal, because once it starts to get going and it's basically refreshing every round, that 2 indirect damage coming can be a problem. Again, not maybe just so much with Groot if you're managing the growth counters properly, but to manage the growth counters properly, you have to go to Alter Ego form, which is going to make the Badoon ship gain more tokens on it anyway. So it's a balancing act. Again, I didn't find them to be too difficult, but it did take me 2 tries on the first try. So let's jump into the next one. Okay, the next villain is the Collector. So super unique villain. I really enjoyed the mechanics of this one. So the Collector's main whole deal here is that he has his collection. There's an area called the collection. That's a face-up area that cards are going to be added to. So his forced interrupt ability in stage 1 is when a card, player or encounter card, would be placed into a discard pile from play, put it face up into the collection instead. Again, from play is super important, because if you just put everything there, even if it's not from play, even if it's from your hand, that thing will fill up so fast this scenario will seem impossible. It's only from play. So again, anytime a card, like think of Rocket's weapons and stuff, if they get discarded, anything, an ally that gets defeated if it's in play, all those ones from play get added to the Collector's collection. Now, that's obviously bad, because now they're not in your discard pile. You can't get them back very easily. But what's even worse is that the main scheme in the Collector scenario is that if there are 5 cards per player in the collection, or if this stage is completed, you lose the game. So if I'm playing with Rocket and Groot, as soon as that collection hits 10 cards, I lose the game, which is crazy tough to deal with. Again, it really depends. I think this took me 2 tries, and the first try I got obliterated, and the second try I actually felt pretty confident throughout. But that you have to manage that collection a lot. So there are ways to get cards back from that collection, and one of those is that on the main scheme there's a hero action, and the hero action is you can choose to either exhaust your hero or spend 2 resources of any type to discard 1 card from the collection. So you don't even gain it to your hand or anything, it goes into your discard pile, but you're basically freeing up a card. And each of the heroes in play can do that once per round, I believe. Yeah, once per round per player. So essentially, if you need every single round, you can, if you're playing with two heroes like Rocket and Groot, you can get 2 cards back from the collection. But still, depending how quick cards are getting added to the collection, that's only mitigating so much. So you're going to have to also be, feeling like you're racing against the clock a little bit to take out the Collector. The good thing is he doesn't have a lot of health. It's only 13 per player. And his attack's only 1, scheme's only 2 in the first phase. Second phase is only 14 health per player, so it's not even that big of a difference. He does have 3 scheme and 2 attack in the second phase, so it gets a little bit more difficult. But overall, the entire mechanic of the Collector with adding cards to this collection and having to deal with that was just such a refreshing take on a scenario and on the villain. I just love when they find these, in the same way that I love that heroes feel so thematic and feel so different from one another. I really appreciate when villains are also not just, see if you can do as much damage as you can, and that's the entire mechanic, or they just have new minions and we've seen, what minions can do, and it's just new versions of those. I like that there's an entire new system with the Collector, and it felt very, very fun to go through it. So the only other cards I'll go over is just a couple of the other things that you'll encounter that I felt were a little tough to deal with. So Inconspicuous Box is a treachery card that when it's revealed, you put the lowest cost card you control face up into the collection. If you cannot, this card gains Surge. This actually really sucks. I've had ones where, I had a cheap ally in play that I was hoping to block with, or, a certain weapon with Rocket, or, one of Groot's kit cards, and because those are all really, really cheap at 1 cost, that suddenly I have to put one of them into the collection, one of my most valuable cards. So it's not only adding to the collection, I'm losing a valuable card from my hero that was in play helping me. So that was a really tough one to deal with. And the boost on it is even actually not that great. If there are 3 3 cards per player or fewer in the collection, put the top card of your deck face up into the collection, which is, a blind card, and it could be devastating depending on what it is. So that was a cool card, a cool treasury card to deal with. The View the Cosmos was super annoying. So this is when revealed, put the highest cost card from your hand face up into the collection. Discard the highest cost card from your hand, then place threat on the main scheme equal to its printed cost as the alternative. So regardless, you're losing the highest cost card in your hand, which twice I believe I had, either, I think one time with Groot I had like Iron Fist in my hand that I'm wanting to play next turn, and with Rocket I had his Particle Cannon, like valuable cards that I'm saying, oh, okay, I'm getting this out next turn, and a lot of my turns are going to revolve around them, and then that card came out and I had no choice but to lose it. You're either losing it to the collection or you're having to lose it to your discard pile, but adding a whole bunch of threat onto the main scheme. So that was it's a really cool treachery card, but man, is it devastating when it comes out. So yeah, that's the Collector. Overall, I really, really enjoyed the Collector a lot more than Drang, and it's one of the more unique villains that I've played out of the campaign, so I really enjoyed it. I wouldn't say it's overly difficult. That being said, it's more difficult than Drang, I thought. And again, I got obliterated the first time. Again, I think it's part of learning Rock and Groot, but also learning a new villain, that the first time I just tend not to do very well. Because I usually go in blind. I don't like look through all the cards and plan too much of a strategy. I kind of let the play be my testing ground. But the second time I felt pretty confident, but it was still like managing the collection becomes this anxiety-inducing system that you're constantly going like, yeah, I feel confident here, but there's also 8 cards in the collection, and I could be doing super well and then still lose if I let that get out of hand. So very cool system, and the Collector is a very cool villain. Okay, the third villain, also the Collector, except this one is Escape the Museum. So I should have said the second scenario is called Infiltrate the Museum. This is Escape the Museum. This was, again, maybe it's just me, and it very well could be, and it could be because of Rock and Groot and because of the way I'm playing. But man, was this a hard scenario. I think I did this like 4 or 5 times before I beat it. I started to think, am I not even going to beat this? Like, I need to test everything in this box to make this review. Am I just going to have to pretend I beat it and forge ahead and come back to this after? I finally did beat it, but oh man, was this really, really difficult. So it's a very interesting and very cool. Again, the 2 Collector scenarios are probably the most unique. Definitely, I would say the most unique in the box, and the ones I had the most fun fighting against. So Collector is a 1 scheme, 1 attack villain that says the Collector gets plus X scheme and plus X attack, where X is equal to the main scheme's current stage number. So in the first stage, obviously, it's just +1, so it's a 2 scheme, 2 attack. The Forced Interrupt is when Collector would be defeated, so when you would kill him, and I should say he only has 8 health per player. Super easy to defeat him, but there's a catch. When Collector would be defeated, remove 3 threat per player from the main scheme and flip this card instead. So he doesn't actually die. He flips to the other side to a different version of the Collector that has 0 scheme, 0 attack, cannot be defeated, has infinite hit points, and the Forced Interrupt is when the round ends, flip this card back, then set the Collector's hit point dial to the full hit points. So basically what's happening here is, the reason this card functions this way is you're not actually winning this scenario by defeating the villain. That is not how you win the scenario, which is why it's really unique. The way you actually defeat the scenario is getting through all 3 scheme cards. So you need to remove all the threat from the scheme cards, and when all the threat is removed, when it hits 0, then you go to the next stage. So it's completely different than what Marvel Champions usually offers. Usually you're trying to prevent the main scheme from advancing, getting as low as you can and managing it, and while you're trying to defeat the villain. In this one, you just want to get through those schemes as quick as possible, because if you get through the third one, you win the game. That is how you win, which is very interesting because it makes for scenarios where you have to decide, am I going to play a Justice ally that can remove a whole bunch of threat and just really go hard after removing threat? Because we're not talking about small amounts of threat here. I think it's the second or third level. It's like 11 threat per player is what starts on the card. So in my case, I had 22 threat on there, and I think it's 30 threat is the threshold where you lose. So depending when you flip it, you could have it flip near the end of one of your character's turns, have 22 threat appear on there, only 8 away from losing, and if the villain has a really successful turn, suddenly you're on the brink of losing because it's going to hit the threat threshold. So it's a very, very cool system, and I had a lot of fun managing when I'm going to beat the collector to flip him to remove, in my case, 6 threat from the main scheme and basically gain a turn where he's only going to have 0 attack and 0 scheme against me, which is some breathing room basically. And when exactly I'm going to flip the main scheme by removing that last threat, so I can try to time it so I can also remove threat off the new incoming version of that scheme. So it was a very, very cool balancing act, and I haven't even talked about the environment cards. So there's an environment card that starts in play with that's called Library Labyrinth, and this is a hero action. Deal yourself 1 face down encounter card to remove 5 threat from the main scheme. So you can only do this once per round per player, but that's upwards of 10 threat per round that you can remove if you're willing to take 2 extra encounter cards, which can obviously suck. And you have to really balance when the best time to do this is. Usually you want to use it when that 5 threat is going to be the one that flips the card, or after you've just flipped a card to remove 5 threats, you're not too close to the threshold. There's a whole bunch of ways you can use that they're effective. I'm not saying those are the only ones to do, but it's just an extra system that's in play. And on top of that, that card eventually gets flipped over and becomes Museum Ship. When that becomes Museum Ship, the ship command comes into play, the Milano comes into play, and you get the ability, which is hold on to your butts, forced interrupt when the villain phase begins, choose one. Exhaust the Milano to assign 2 per player indirect damage among the players, which would be 4 among the players, or assign 3 per player indirect damage among all players. So then you're getting a whole bunch of damage coming in from the Museum Ship. That's I think in the last part of the main scheme. When you get to the 3rd stage, that's when that flips and becomes Museum Ship. It's a very difficult scenario, at least for me. Again, maybe someone's going to tell me, oh, that was the easiest one for me. But man, did I struggle with this. I don't know if it's because of Groot and Rocket specifically or what it was. I tried on one of the games switching Rocket's aspect completely from aggression to justice, and in my head I'm thinking, I'm gonna go full justice. I'm gonna remove so much threat that I'm gonna get through this super quick. I'm barely even gonna do damage to the collector. I'm just gonna focus on removing threat, do it as quick as I can, and get through this. That did not work. I did way worse when I did that than the other way around. When I ended up winning, I found a really important balance between how many times I beat the collector to flip him, and how much I was actually managing the threat on the main scheme. So I think in the game I won, I beat the collector 4 times, I think, which every time removes 6 threats. So again, that's like 24 threat just from beating him, because he doesn't have that much health, and I was able to find ways to beat him pretty good, or pretty effectively. And I had to just not get too greedy with removing threat off the main scheme. I didn't rely on the Library Labyrinth card to deal myself encounter cards too often. I think I did it once or twice, and other than that, I was fine. I was just taking my time and showing patience. But man, did I enjoy this villain. This was a really fun one, but it is hard. The only cards I'll mention that come up in it are Impossible Geometry. So when it is revealed, it has Incite 1, which just adds 1 threat to the main scheme. In this particular scenario, that obviously is not great. Well, when it's revealed, you're confused. If you are already confused, choose and discard 1 card you control. Being confused in this scenario and not being able to remove threat is a big deal. And there's a few of those in his deck, so those really suck. The other one is I Have You Now, which is when revealed in Alter Ego, exhaust your identity and the collector schemes. When revealed in Hero, you are stunned and the collector attacks you. Both are really bad. This card, and even on the boost, giving the collector a tough status card if you're trying to beat him to remove threat is pretty bad. So overall, yeah, tough scenario. It's not the toughest villain in this set. I think, in my opinion, it's the 2nd toughest in the entire box, at least in my experience with Rocket and Groot. Again, it's going to vary depending which heroes you use. If you use heroes that are very, very effective threat removers, and don't even use Rocket and Groot completely, you could have a completely different experience. But with Rocket and Groot, I played solo with Rocket and Groot going through the entire campaign. I found this to be the 2nd toughest in the entire box. So very cool scenario, but very difficult. Okay, the 4th villain is Nebula. So Nebula, I'm going to say, for me, it was probably the 2nd easiest one in the box. Now, before you say, oh, how could you say that? It was super difficult. I probably got kind of lucky. I recognized that as I was playing. Nebula drew pretty bad on some things, and I was having just like the right cards come up at the right time. This is the only scenario in the entire box that I beat on the first try. So again, it could be very much me getting lucky. Maybe that's a universal thing. Maybe Nebula is just a little bit underwhelming in terms of power level. That being said, it's actually a fun scenario, and there's some pretty unique things going on here. So the whole Nebula mechanic is that she has these technique attachments. So her for the stage 1 villain card says the first technique attachment revealed each round gains surge. So she has tons of techniques, and every time you reveal one, it's going to surge into something else, potentially another attachment. The forced interrupt is when Nebula initiates an activation against you. Resolve the special ability on each technique attachment in play. Then discard each of those attachments. So every technique attachment, has a special ability. Nebula's whole thing is she wants to stack a bunch of attachments onto herself, activate, have all the specials take effect, and then they all get discarded and she has to start this process again. For me, her having to discard the attachments is what made this not too difficult to deal with. Generally, I never had, I think one time I had 3 attachments on her at once because of some bad draws, but generally it was 1 or 2, and then they would get discarded, and I didn't really care too much about, having to deal with the special abilities. They weren't too overwhelming in my particular game I played. So I think that's why I didn't find her to be too difficult, but I can see how this can snowball pretty bad. So the main scheme is 6 per player for stage 1 is the threshold, and the ability is the X value is equal to the number of evasion counters on Nebula's ship, and the X value controls how much threat you're adding on each villain stage. So Nebula's ship is another environment that comes into play in this one, and it is when the villain phase begins, place 1 evasion counter on here. Shoot the thrusters, first player action, only the first player. Exhaust the Milano and spend up to 2 resources of any type, so you can spend 1 if you want. Remove 1 invasion counter from this card for each resource spent this way. So the reason you're wanting to remove evasion counters from here is because otherwise the threat on the main scheme racks up quick. I beat Nebula, but when I beat her, my heroes were at very high health. I didn't feel very threatened by Nebula directly, but the threat on the main scheme was so close to going over the edge because the amount of counters on Nebula's ship had racked up quick. So that's the biggest thing, in my opinion. That's the biggest thing to manage with Nebula. It's not the attachments, it's her ship. Keep that under control, and generally, I don't think you'll have too much trouble dealing with the attachments, even when you get some bad luck and they start to stack with some of their abilities. That's just my opinion. That's in the game I played. Could be different depending which heroes you're playing with. Some of the cards you're going to encounter, there's a side scheme called Lethal Intent that is going to discard cards from the top of the encounter deck until a technique attachment is discarded. Then you reveal it and basically put it into play, and it's going to give you an extra encounter card during the encounter card step, which really, really sucks. Some of the techniques that you're going to technique attachments you're going to see, for instance, are wide stance, reduce the amount of damage Nebula takes from each attack by 1. Surprisingly difficult to deal with. I had that out, and actually, there was a turn where I could have beat Nebula, I think, in her first stage, and this came out and it negated the 3 attacks I was going to do. Each would lose 1 damage, and suddenly I couldn't beat her. This really sucks. And the special ability is to discard 1 card at random from your hand, which is also really, really bad. So there's a couple of those in the deck. There's also Cutthroat Ambition, which is Nebula cannot take more than 5 damage in a single attack. Funny thing is, when I beat Nebula, I had a huge Groot attack because he had 10 growth counters on him that I was just going to beat her in 1 hit. This got attached to Nebula, and I was like, oh, I'm going to lose now. I needed to beat her on this turn, I think, because the threat on the main scheme was going to overwhelm. And then something else she drew, or something else got drawn that triggered her to use the special ability. She activated against me, that's what it was. And she had to use the special ability and discard this, which freed her up for me to do the 10 damage on her. So again, the discarding attachments is something you just really have to keep in mind. But yeah, every attachment, none of them are great to deal with, but I wouldn't say any of them completely became too overwhelming for me, except for the 1 instance where there was 3 stacked and I took a whole bunch of stuff at the same time. But other than that, I didn't find Nebula to be too difficult. Okay, let's move on to the final villain. Okay, Ronan the Accuser. Now, I'm going to make a bold claim here. I'm going to make a bold claim, and I'm ready for people to disagree with me and for me to be proven wrong. Totally fine. It's early with this having come out. I don't think we can make definitive calls, but I'm going to say that there is a good chance that Ronan the Accuser might be the most difficult villain in the game so far. And the only reason I'm saying that is because I've never played against a villain, and it might be because I'm using Rocket and Groot specifically. Maybe they are just, it's funny because they come in this box, but maybe they're not the most effective pair to use against Ronan. So I'm just going to say, I should clarify, using Rocket and Groot, this has got to be the most difficult villain in the game. Ronan is so difficult without necessarily having a very unique mechanic. It's not like the collector where it's this brand new, feels very, very new. Ronan's just going to completely overwhelm you. You're going to be drawing tons of encounter cards. You're going to be taking huge attacks from him. Everything is just going to feel completely overwhelming. And I think the first game I played against Ronan, I think I lost on like the third or fourth turn. Like I was not anticipating, again, I didn't read all the cards in advance. I was not anticipating what was going to happen, and I got destroyed. It took me, it might have taken me 10 tries. It was somewhere between 8 and 10 tries to beat Ronan, and I barely beat him. And that was with getting some like good luck on the one where I beat him. He is just tough. He has, his first stage has toughness on him, so he starts with a tough counter. When Ronan the Accuser activates against you, give him an additional boost card if you control the Power Stone. He's going to keep finding ways to get the Power Stone. In his second phase, search the encounter deck and discard pile for the cut the power side schemer and reveal it and put it into play. That's going to cause a lot of problems for you. Again, he's going to continue to get more boost cards. The main scheme only has 2 phases, and on the second phase, while the Power Stone is attached to Ronan, threat cannot be removed from the main scheme. So if you don't take the Power Stone away from him, you can't do anything about the threat on the main scheme, and that you're going to lose that way. So that becomes something you're managing. Okay, get me the Power Stone back so I can actually deal with the main scheme. But while you're doing that, he's getting so many encounter cards dealt towards you. Like his Kree command ship environment card just adds an encounter card that's going to be dealt to every single round. The first player interrupt on there is when a treachery card is revealed from the encounter deck. You can exhaust the Milano and spend a resource to cancel that card's when revealed effect. So that's sort of the counter there. You can ignore some of these cards because you're getting dealt so many of them. Then he has the Universal Weapon, which is an attachment that gives him Stalwart. He can't be stunned or confused, which is, a way you could have dealt with Ronan. That's now off the table. Hero action is you can take 2 damage and deal yourself another face down encounter card to shuffle the Universal Weapon back into his deck. It's not even discarded, it's just put into his deck for later. But whenever he has that attached to him, he's going to get +1 scheme and +1 attack. Pincer Movement is a side scheme that gives you 2 acceleration tokens on the main scheme, which is a real pain. It starts with 3 threat on it, but also an additional 2 per player because of the hinder action on it. You can exhaust the Milano to remove 3 threat from that scheme though, so it's not impossible to deal with by any means, but it's just while it's out, it's really hindering you. You stand accused. I think there's 3 copies in the deck. When it's revealed, he schemes for +1 or he attacks for +1 depending which form you're in. If it's a boost card, give the villain an additional boost card. Kree Physiology has Surge. There's a lot of cards in his deck that are awful but also have Surge and Surge into other ones. So this starts with Surge, but then also give Ronan the Accuser a tough status card, and if he already has one, you take a damage. Single-Minded Fury. When revealed, Ronan the Accuser attacks the player who controls the Power Stone, even if that player is in Alter Ego form, which is nuts, because normally you can go to Alter Ego form and feel safer with the Power Stone. If no attack was made, this card gains Surge. Again, if he does 3 damage minimum, he's going to gain that Power Stone back. It's just nothing about them feels overly unique. There's not this crazy mechanic that I'm explaining to you that you're like, oh yeah, that mechanic sounds very difficult. He's almost the most, I don't want to say most basic, but like least flashy of the villains in the box. But he's just so strong. Like the modular sets that are in there. By that point, you probably have Badoon Headhunter cards in there. Everything just adds up to create this very, very difficult scenario. And I think it's partially that difficult because by that point you will have bought a bunch of cards from the market that are overpowered, and hopefully those cards are going to help you swing the game. And in the game I did beat him. It was because I drew all my market cards. They did swing the game, gave me huge turns, and I was able to pull it off. So again, he doesn't have crazy amounts of health, but it's also not low. His second form has 18 per player. And again, I did this whole thing on normal mode. So on expert mode, I imagine this is even more difficult. So yeah, Ronan the Accuser is by far, in my opinion, the toughest villain in this box. And again, he might be one of, if not the toughest villain introduced so far. That's my humble opinion, and it's only with me having had this box for, a week and a half. It's early. I can't really completely definitively make that call, but man, was he difficult the first time I played him using Rock and Groot specifically. So those are all the villains. If I had to rank them from most difficult to least difficult, I would put Ronan as the most difficult. Then I would put the second collector, which is the Escape the Museum, as the second most difficult. Then I would put the other collector, which is Infiltrate the Museum, as the third. Then it would be Nebula, and then it would be Krang. Is it Krang? Is that his name? Drang, not Krang. Drang. Good thing I looked. That would have been embarrassing. That would be my order specifically. Again, you might have a different one depending which heroes you used, if you played solo, if you played multiplayer, how these games played out for you. There's a lot of factors. We can't really make a definitive call saying, oh yeah, this is by far the way it is. In my experience through the campaign, that's what I found. So hopefully that helped you out with the villains and gave you a little bit of an idea of what to expect. And I'd love to hear from you in the comments what your experience was with the villains, which ones you found most difficult, and how many tries some of these villains took for you to beat. Okay, so let's end this off by me giving you my full thoughts on Galaxy's Most Wanted. And I'll keep this somewhat short because I've already kind of gone through a bunch of stuff in detail, but overall I loved this expansion. It is very difficult. If this is you're going to be your introduction to Marvel Champions, like if you're going to go buy the core set and this and dive right into these villains to start, you're going to think this game is a lot more difficult than it probably is. This probably isn't the best place to start. If you don't have Rise of the Red Skull, I wouldn't say you have to start there because I almost think that this is more. I had more fun with this than Rise of the Red Skull. I'll just, spoiler alert, I'll say that now. So I would say if you're going to buy one, part of me wants to recommend buying this one. That being said, Rise of the Red Skull will probably be the place to start in terms of difficulty curve to lead into this one. But it's very, very fun despite the difficulty. There's unique scenarios in there that are going to feel very different from other villains you've played. It's going to make the game feel a lot different and add a whole other twist onto the mechanics compared to what you've dealt with so far. The two heroes you get in the box are very solid. That was one of the complaints with the Rise of the Red Skull is that not a lot of people enjoyed Hawkeye specifically. I actually enjoyed Hawkeye, so it wasn't as big of a deal. And Spider-Woman, because of the deck building mechanics, I found to be very interesting. I would argue that the two heroes in this box are more interesting and were more fun than the two that were introduced in Rise of the Red Skull, like compared against each other. Rocket and Groot are really, really fun. They both introduce really cool new mechanics, and it's the introduction of the Guardians of the Galaxy, which is just really, really exciting. The modular sets that you're gaining that you can use in other villains are really, really cool. The Ship Command one specifically is just tons of fun, and I'm interested to see how that gets used in other situations as well. Overall, the value here I think is great. You get two great heroes. You get 5 really difficult villains, 3 of which are, I would say, very, very either interesting or difficult enough that you're going to want to come back and challenge them with a bunch of different heroes. I could see people wanting to play against Ronan in a bunch of different situations and find what is the most effective way to just demolish Ronan and get him back for all the times he might have beat you up to that point. I would highly recommend getting Galaxy's Most Wanted. Again, as long as you're okay with the challenge. If you're getting introduced to Marvel Champions, or you're just buying it to figure out, am I going to like this? Or I'm just wanting to dip my toe in the water. This is not the pack you dip your toe in the water for. You play the core set, potentially get Rise of the Red Skull first, try the campaign out there, see how that system works, get those heroes, play through that campaign, get familiar with it, then jump into this. However, if you're fine with the challenge and if you're wanting just, which is the better box, I personally think Galaxy's Most Wanted is slightly better than Rise of the Red Skull in terms of the campaign, in terms of the villain variety, in terms of the heroes you get, and even just the way the marketplace and victory display works, I think is really, really cool. I'm coming from, again, having played Arkham, so I just like that they took them and borrowed that mechanic from Arkham, the card game. But yeah, overall, I'm very satisfied with Galaxy's Most Wanted. I love it. It would have been really hard for me not to be satisfied. They would have really had to have, dropped the ball for me not to enjoy this because it's the introduction of the Guardians, which are, fan favorite characters of mine. But overall, very, very good pack, and I would highly recommend adding it to your Marvel Champions collection. So that's it. We've gone through Rocket, we've gone through Groot, we've gone through everything in the box. I'm finally all exhausted out with content for Galaxy's Most Wanted. I hope you've enjoyed these videos, and I hope you enjoyed the information and it's helped you out in some way. If you liked it, give it a like, leave me a comment, subscribe to the channel, tell a friend, whatever you can. I really, really appreciate it. Otherwise, thanks so much for watching, and I'm sure sometime in the near future, Fantasy Flight is going to announce another new hero, and I'll be back with a bunch of content covering that as well. So see you in the next one.